What if I told you that a lot of what you were taught in school is not the whole truth? Some facts were simply removed. Today, you will learn 10 amazing facts that were not included in school textbooks. Are you ready to be amazed? The myth of the loser. Einstein. You most likely heard this in school. Even Einstein was a loser. Sounds inspiring, right? The problem is, it's not true. Albert Einstein showed outstanding abilities in mathematics and physics from childhood. At the age of 11, he was reading university textbooks, and by the age of 12, he was already solving complex algebraic equations. So, where did the myth come from? In 1895, 16-year-old Einstein tried to enter the Zurich Polytechnic Institute. He passed the science exams with ease, but failed the humanities section, especially French, which is what most of the tests were conducted in. He was simply not accepted due to his insufficient knowledge of the language. He later got in without any problems and soon started a revolution in science. But the myth remained. Why? Because society conveniently uses him as an example of how losers can become great. In fact, Einstein was not a loser. He was a genius who faced a language barrier. The United States dropped nuclear bombs on itself twice. Sounds like a fake or a joke. But this is a real historical fact that is hushed up in textbooks. The United States actually accidentally dropped 2 nuclear bombs on its territory. And it happened not once, but twice. The first incident, 1958, South Carolina, a B-47 Stratojet military bomber collided with another aircraft in midair. To avoid an explosion during an emergency landing, the crew dropped a nuclear bomb near the town of Mars Bluff. The bomb did not explode nuclearly, but its conventional charge detonated, destroying a house and leaving a huge crater. Fortunately, no one was killed, but several people were injured. The second case, 1961, North Carolina. A B-52 Stratofortress bomber broke apart in the air. 2 Mark 39 atomic bombs fell out and landed near the town of Goldsboro. One of the bombs had passed 5 of the 6 stages of preparation for the explosion. If the 6th had worked, the charge would have exploded with a power 250 times greater than in Hiroshima. Result: a disaster was miraculously avoided. Why is this silent? Such incidents are too embarrassing and dangerous for a reputation. This shows how vulnerable even a superpower can be to its own mistakes. This fact is not often covered in official sources, but it perfectly shows how thin the line is between peace and disaster. Cleopatra was closer to the time of the iPhone than to the construction of the pyramids. This is one of those facts that turns the perception of history upside down. We are used to thinking about ancient Egypt as something uniform. Everything happened a long time ago. Pharaohs, pyramids, Cleopatra. But the historical reality is much more interesting. When did Cleopatra live? Cleopatra VII, the last queen of Egypt, lived from 69 BC to 30 BC. She was a contemporary of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and the Roman Empire was already gaining strength. When were the pyramids built? The Great Pyramid of Cheops in Giza was built around 2560 BC. This means that between the construction of the pyramid and the birth of Cleopatra, there were about 2,500 years. And before the iPhone, the first iPhone came out and if you do the math, a little over 2,000 years passed from Cleopatra to us. Simple math: Cleopatra, Pyramid of Cheops. 2,500 years, Cleopatra. iPhone, 2,000 years, conclusion. Cleopatra is closer in time to the invention of the smartphone than to the construction of the pyramids. This completely breaks the usual idea of antiquity and shows how long-lived the Egyptian civilization was, and how much the timescale in our perception is distorted. Napoleon was not short. If you've ever heard the expression Napoleon complex, You know how often the French emperor is portrayed as a small man with a big ego. But this is actually a historical misconception. How tall was Napoleon really? Historical records indicate that Napoleon was about 5 feet 2 inches tall in the French system of measurements. But pay attention, a French foot is longer than a British foot. Converted to modern units, this is about 169 centimeters. Was this a normal height? Yes, by the standards of the late 18th, early 19th centuries, 169 centimeters was quite an average height for a man. For example, the average height of the French at that time was about 165 to 167 centimeters. Where did the myth come from? 1. Confusion in measurement systems. Napoleon's English enemies converted his height to their system and considered him shorter than he was. 2. British propaganda. After Napoleon's defeat, the British deliberately ridiculed him, creating the image of a small, evil dictator to belittle his greatness. 3. Artistic caricatures. In the 19th century, satirical images became popular, where Napoleon was drawn as tiny and aggressive. And why is he always surrounded by tall guards? This is another visual trick. The Imperial Guard really did consist of the tallest and strongest soldiers, so Napoleon next to them seemed shorter than he actually was. Conclusion: Napoleon was not short. He was of average height by the standards of his time. The myth of his small stature is the result of British propaganda, a translation error, and visual exaggerations. The Roman Empire did not fall in one day. In school textbooks, you can often find a clear date, the fall of the Roman Empire. But this is a simplification that distorts the real picture. In reality, Rome died slowly, over decades, even centuries. What happened in 476? That was the year the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic warlord Odoacer. Symbolic? Yes. But it was not an instant collapse, as is commonly believed. The empire had already been weakened by internal crises, corruption, economic decline, and barbarian raids long before that. But what about the Eastern Roman Empire? It is often forgotten that the Roman Empire was divided into Western and Eastern. Well, the eastern part, the Byzantine Empire, continued to exist for almost 1,000 years. Its capital was Constantinople, and it fell only in 1453, when the city was captured by the Ottomans. What destroyed the empire? Rome did not fall because of one event. It was a slow process of degradation caused by many factors. Political instability and corruption, splitting the empire into 2 parts. Economic crisis and inflation, wars with barbarians and mercenary armies, weakening of the army and loss of discipline, decline of civil infrastructure. Interesting fact, even after 476, many barbarian kings continued to consider themselves the heirs of Rome. They bore Roman titles and ruled according to Roman laws. The idea of Rome did not disappear. It simply transformed. Conclusion: the Roman Empire did not collapse in one day. It was a long, painful decline of civilization, which ended not in collapse, but in transformation into other forms of power and culture. This approach helps to better understand how historical processes are structured. They rarely happen at the click of a button. Beethoven was not completely deaf. Beethoven is one of the greatest composers in the history of music, and there are many legends about his deafness. It is often said that he composed music while being completely deaf, immersed in absolute silence. However, in reality, the situation was more complicated. Beethoven began to lose his hearing at a young age, and by the later years of his life, he was really severely deaf, but did not completely lose his hearing. He retained partial perception of sounds, especially low frequencies. In order to hear better, he used special ear tubes, simple devices that amplified sounds and helped to catch music and conversations. This peculiarity of his condition does not diminish his greatness, but on the contrary, emphasizes the incredible strength of spirit and perseverance of the composer who continued to create and produce masterpieces despite serious physical difficulties. The truth about partial deafness makes his image more realistic and inspiring. In ancient Sparta, there were not only warriors. In ancient Sparta, there is a persistent image of an exclusively warlike society, where every resident is a stern soldier who devoted his whole life to war and preparation for it. However, historical data shows that this stereotype is greatly simplified and does not reflect the fullness of life in Sparta. In addition to warriors, artisans lived in Sparta, who were engaged in the manufacture of goods and tools, as well as officials who governed the city and monitored compliance with the laws. In addition, in Spartan society, there were scientists and philosophers who studied various sciences and taught young citizens. Art, including music and poetry, also had its place in Spartan culture. Thus, ancient Sparta was a much more diverse and multifaceted society than is commonly believed, and its image as a pure military machine is the result of simplistic perceptions and modern myths. Columbus did not discover America. Christopher Columbus is often called the discoverer of America, but this statement is not entirely accurate. In fact, Columbus never set foot on the territory of North America. He explored only the Caribbean islands and parts of Central and South America. Historians have also proven that 500 years before Columbus, Vikings led by Leif Erikson reached the North American coast, settling in the area of modern Newfoundland in Canada. This fact was long hushed up or ignored in history books, creating the false impression that Columbus was the first European to discover the New World. The reality is much more complex and interesting, and the merits of different cultures and peoples in the development of America deserve recognition. The Middle Ages were not a time of dark ages. Many people still imagine the Middle Ages as an era of complete decline. Gloomy castles, fires of the Inquisition, dirty streets, and a complete lack of progress. But this is a myth created during the Renaissance to emphasize its enlightenment, in contrast to the supposedly dark past. In fact, the Middle Ages gave the world a huge number of achievements. It was then that the first universities were born: Bologna, Paris, Oxford. The systematization of law began. The first forms of parliaments and legal protection appeared. Architecture reached the greatest heights. Gothic cathedrals such as Notre Dame and Cologne Cathedral still amaze with their craftsmanship. Moreover, scientific and philosophical work was carried out in monasteries. The works of ancient thinkers were preserved and copied. The stars, mathematics, and medicine were studied. Even glasses and mechanical watches are inventions of the Middle Ages. The myth of the Dark Ages is nothing more than a simplistic picture that forgets about the enormous contribution of this era to science, culture, and civilization. The Middle Ages are not darkness, but the foundation on which modern Europe stands. The USSR had the first person born in space, almost. It sounds like a plot of science fiction, but the USSR really considered the possibility of a person being born in space. In the 1980s, at the peak of the space race, Soviet scientists were developing classified projects to create long-term orbital missions in which the crew could stay in space for months or even years. One of these projects, according to rumors, even included an experiment in conceiving and giving birth to a child in zero gravity. Of course, officially, nothing of the sort happened. However, in 1984, Svetlana Savitskaya became the first woman in history to go into outer space. She performed unique work, including welding and cutting metal, something no one had done before. Her flight and achievements proved that women can perform the same tasks in space as men. It also fueled interest in the idea of long-term mixed crews. Although the idea of being born in space remained only on paper, documents and drafts from those years do exist. They are still classified or little known to the general public. The USSR seriously considered space not only as a place for experiments and satellites, but also as a possible environment for future colonization. So the first person born outside of Earth could have appeared in the 20th century if history had gone a little differently. History, science, culture, all this is not as simple as it seems in textbooks. Now you know a little more than most. Did you like the issue? Then subscribe and press the bell. There are even more amazing facts ahead.